So welcome everybody. I just wanted to do some quick introductions and then hand it over to Leila Farah, who will be running this presentation. So we're here for Simon Gordon's final thesis presentation, Syn-anthropocene Center. And I'll start by introducing our two external guest critics. We have Joyce Wang, Assistant Professor at SUNY Buffalo and Director of Ants of the Prairie, and Lola Shepard, Associate Professor at the University of Waterloo and Partner in Lateral Office. So thank you both so much for joining us. The committee for Simon is myself, Marco Polo, as supervisor, Terry Peters as second reader, and Leila Farah is the program rep, and therefore will be running the review this afternoon. We're also joined by one of Simon's colleagues from practice, Anthony Frazina, who's also one of our alum. So hi, Anthony. So anytime you're ready, Leila.
Hey, thank you very much, Marco. So welcome all. We're delighted to have you, and we're very pleased to hear Simon Gordon, his final presentation titled "Into the Syn-anthropocene: the Resynchronized Architecture of a Keystone Species." So you have about 20 minutes to present, and then we'll have time for questions, hopefully 2 rounds of questions. Okay?
Sure, sounds good. I'm just going to connect the presentation. Okay, can you all see it?
That's right. Yes, we can.
Yes,
okay.
Good to go.
Okay, great. So thank you for joining. I'm very glad to have Lola and Joyce come on as guests. And thank you to the committee and everyone else that's joining in for my final thesis presentation. This work is titled Into the Syn-anthropocene, the Resynchronized Architecture of a Keystone Species. I'll start by unpacking a few terms. The Anthropocene is a popularized term for an emerging geological age of the Earth. It is a time period characterized by the environment's vulnerability to the immense influence of human activity. In the spirit of pursuing a counter-narrative to this, I proposed a modification of this term. The Syn-anthropocene would be an age where human activity and interventions have a positive ecological impact and promotes coexistence with other species. I based this term on a word that I encountered in my research, a composite of the Greek word anthropos, meaning man, and the prefix syn, meaning with. A synanthrope is an undomesticated animal that benefits from associating with the human environment. Finally, to recognize that many animals are negatively impacted by artificial landscapes, I've also come up with the term anthrope. Modern urban landscapes are a radically new type of environment that has emerged very recently across the planet from an evolutionary perspective. They are the product of the fast-paced process of cultural evolution, which can be said to be out of sync with the much slower process of biological evolution. The incentive for this thesis is to investigate how architecture can serve as a link that would resynchronize these two processes. It asks, how can the urban landscape be designed to be more in sync with its surrounding wildlife? Much of the relationship between culture and nature throughout history has been that of antagonism, but never so pronounced as in recent times. Populations of thousands of different species worldwide have declined by more than 60% only within the span of the last 5 decades. The urban landscape poses dangers to wildlife in various ways. Their senses are disoriented by the city's lights, sounds, and heavy traffic. Streets and buildings are hotbeds for collisions that perpetuate habitat fragmentation, which isolates entire populations of animals. While some do find shelter and food in the urban environment, many animals are endangered by it. However, since the city is a product of design, it is also a place where people can make a difference. There is a paradigm shift in contemporary architectural discourse with the emergence of terms like habitecture, biodiversity-sensitive urban design, and synanthropic architecture. They are part of a broader effort to re-envision architecture as being resynchronized with the environment. I've set out to explore the design of this hybrid environment and framed a number of key objectives. In the scope of this strategy, the safeguarding of human safety is paramount. This hierarchy also elevates the needs of wildlife, such as the requirement for a circulation network, as well as protected and integrated habitats. Finally, there is also a cultural dimension that emerges from this symbiotic relationship. Opportunities to create an immersive experience that connects people with their surrounding biosphere. I've chosen Toronto as the site to explore this design intervention. The city is actually situated on the edge of the Carolinian forest, a precious parcel of land with a unique climate made possible by the Great Lakes that has the greatest concentration of biodiversity in Canada. It hosts 1/3 of the country's endangered species. Despite being heavily urbanized, Toronto is dotted with an abundance of parks and green corridors that serve as the city's remaining bastions of natural habitat. After visiting and discovering the rich biodiversity in these various locations, I selected a number of creatures to focus on that would inform this developing strategy. The animals that I selected were intended to act as broad representatives of a wider category of subjects with similar characteristics and behaviors. This particular selection, however, also consists of animals that, each in their own way, actually have a closer relationship to the urban environment. That being said, even with their greater level of adaptability, they still face tremendous challenges, and some are even endangered. A deeper investigation of these specific animals developed into a series of design interventions. The little brown bat, for example, ventures into human territory to hunt insects near street lamps and bodies of water. They prefer to roost inside of tight and well-protected crevices, wherever they're found. A specially designed bat house might actually be a preferable option. After researching and constructing this bat house prototype, which you can see to your right there, I also developed another variation of a bat roost that can be integrated into a standard wood frame construction system. Moving the design of these interventions beyond the micro scale, I intended to develop an overall strategy that operates on a broader level. At the mesoscale, various nodes in the urban environment would connect with each other and nearby natural habitat. These connections form a greater network at the macro level that acts to strengthen the integrity of the overall urban ecosystem. One method for creating these connections would be by repurposing parts of the city. Various older neighborhoods in Toronto with back lanes have reduced vehicle activity as people increasingly rely on bicycles and public transit. These inactive zones can be repurposed more effectively as green corridors. The garage structures in these lanes could be rededicated as habitat compartments. Rewilding entire segments of the city can have various biophilic benefits to the community, from proximity to natural scenery, as well as benefits of carbon sequestration and reduced heat island effect. Another central idea to my thesis is that it actually doesn't take much to have tremendous impact. While the raccoon is often thought of as highly adaptable, even this creature faces many challenges in a landscape where the tectonics don't cater to its behavioral activity. However, even just a slight alteration in architectural design can actually cascade into having significant ecological utility. Having looked at the barn owl, I researched various requirements that they have to develop an adequate habitat design as well. For an animal whose very taxonomy suggests a strong relationship to the built environment, it's surprising to discover that there are only 5 pairs remaining in Ontario. This is due to habitat loss and the recent prevalence of bird-proof barns. Considering these various creatures, I designed a dedicated structure for animal inhabitation. Emulating the conditions of a chimney shaft for the raccoon, I developed an enclosed tower. Having a slight incline to the wall with a stepping design allows the raccoon to climb up to the den. The tower then angles outwards to prevent them from reaching the bird's nests above. Following the data for the minimum opening requirements for these animals, each of their respective doorways protect against larger predators. This tower can be the first of many similar iterations that facilitate habitat for different creatures in the city. The final challenge for this thesis is exploring architecture as a vehicle to develop a socio-ecological hub, a place where nature and culture intertwine. The Urban Ecopoiesis by Ko Hao Yu was designed as a school in Singapore with an environmentally focused agenda. The building connects with local ecological systems and operates outdoor educational activities. The Ford Calumet Environmental Center promotes an ecological program through workshops and different training activities. These places create an immersive environment that communicates a mutual relationship between communities and their local ecology. The Bickford Center in Toronto was selected as an optimal site for this type of intervention. It is situated in the Annex neighborhood in between a string of parks that run over top the historic Garrison Creek that's buried underground. On one side, the site meets the bustling activity of Bloor Street, and on the other, it consists of the quiet stillness of Bickford Park that dips well below street level. This former high school built in the 60s is now an adult learning center, although parts of it are unused and others are in great disrepair. Approaching from Bloor Street, a wide set of stairs lead down towards a paved plaza and green space. From there, it is possible to either continue forward along an elevated catwalk that leads to the main entrance, or downwards along an adjacent set of stairs. The building has a theater accessible at this level and a gym and a pool at the level below. Above this floor, there is another block that consists of 3 levels of classroom space. The lower level has an open throughway that connects the entry plaza on Bloor Street with Bickford Park to the south. The building also forms an interior courtyard at the center of this passage. In seeking to design a Syn-anthropic center, I've proposed several modifications to the building. The entrance would be moved to a new addition that connects the building with Bloor Street. The old entry catwalk would be removed, making room for a wider redeveloped plaza space. The big block at the south end would be entirely gutted and built into a larger structure that plays a central role in the overall scheme. The building also integrates with the sloping landscape to create various habitat environments, including a wetland that blends into the park. The facility would adopt an ecologically focused program, promoting education about local biodiversity through organized activities as well as an immersive architectural experience. The center would support a range of educational methodologies using various classroom spaces, exhibition galleries, workshops, labs, presentation hall, and a library. While some of these are more private, visitors have a direct view into some of these areas from a central corridor that extends from the lobby. It continues through the exhibition hall to a spiral stair that leads up to the space above, where the focal point of the project takes place. This central axis through the site informs the directionality of the project, both inside and out. This line is framed and amplified by the lobby addition that elongates this corridor, which runs parallel to the adjacent underpass. This axial center line is meant to link the opposite sides of the site, both for people and animals. The facility acts as a node within a continuous ecological system in the neighborhood. The rewilded lanes nearby interconnect as a network that provides uninterrupted access to this locus of habitat. The building has multiple wildlife circulation pathways. The lobby addition is fitted with an overhead crossing that extends over Bloor Street to connect to Christie Pitts Park on the north. The redeveloped green roof has places for animals to forage and inhabit. The lobby encloses a garden that dips below street level, creating a habitat that animals can access from a crawl space underneath it. The large block to the south has corridors for animals, as well as nesting sites in the pods that penetrate the facade. A number of obelisk structures are also placed throughout this hybrid landscape. The main space at the back of the building aims to achieve an enclosed environment that is shared by both humans and wildlife, a heterogeneous space. Inspired by the Amazon spheres in Seattle, this space cultivates a rich environment of natural growth. Animals can enter the space from the outside through various vestibules and window openings. While the bottom floor is given over entirely to animals, people can navigate this space using elevated walkways. Weather permitting, animals are able to permeate through this space day and night. In places both low and high, animals can forage, move about, and find nesting sites. This multi-story block is built as a large wood frame structure over top the existing column grid, which supports the various natural elements and built structures within this spacious framework. This study model of the classroom pods illustrates the intent for incorporating notches and grooves into their exterior walls. These indentations provide habitat opportunities as well as a more tectonic surface for animals to climb. The elevated platforms meet the pod at the doorway, but circle around the rest of it in order to create some distance between humans and the animals residing within these pockets. People moving through these platforms can observe a host of ecological activity, be it birds and butterflies flying about, mammals crawling and climbing, and all manner of creatures living in the pockets of this space. The building integrates extensively with the park on the south side. The existing pool is converted into a wetland that is fed by a waterfall of harvested water. This helps to boost the local ecology as it provides animals with a lush water source. This stream also acts as a cultural artifact that pays homage to the historic Garrison Creek that's buried underneath. Other various areas blend with the landscape to provide access for animals to move into the building. The building envelope is designed to follow the parameters of bird-friendly guidelines. The contour of the exterior wood facade undulates organically to contrast the building's overall orthogonal geometry. Cutouts through this facade demarcate a void space where birds can enter when the operable windows are opened up. The facade wraps around the building, but the wood slats stop on the north side. Here from Bloor Street, passersby can peer into this hub of activity, seeing the blurry motion of vague shapes in behind the semi-transparent glass. This street-facing side with solid pods penetrating through the glazing is a kind of polar opposite to the park-facing side that has voids in the facade. After having a glimpse into the building's inner workings, curious visitors can walk through will come across an internal courtyard, which serves as a kind of laboratory. Here, habitat designs that have been built in the adjacent workshop space would be tested and displayed. Should they choose to explore further and enter the building within, the facility provides a range of educational activities and an immersive environment bustling with ecological activity. It supports a program where people are not only observers, but learn how to be active participants in their own biosphere. In the wake of an emerging paradigm shift, the Syn-anthropic Center celebrates the relationship between communities and their surrounding biodiversity. It produces a hybrid architectural framework that creates synergy between culture and nature. It is part of a greater effort to re-envision society's place within its biome, to reimagine humanity as a keystone species, and to carry it forward into the Syn-anthropocene. Finally, I'd like to end with a quick reflection that relates to our current predicament, which has developed worldwide. The onset of COVID-19 has forced us into a lockdown and will undoubtedly have an impact on how we approach architectural design. It has also revealed the extent of biodiversity that has been living in the margins of our cities. Rather than returning to a future where animals continue to be pushed back, what if there is another way? Perhaps urban environments can be designed with an alternative strategy that considers wildlife and genuinely integrates them into what would be a shared synanthropic landscape. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for your presentation. If there's any question for clarification, maybe that would be the time now to ask, and then if not, then we can start with our guests, either Joyce or Lola, to start commenting and providing feedback. But first, if there's a point of clarification.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Joyce.
Sorry, go ahead, Lola.
No, go ahead.
No, my question for clarification is just, I'm wondering if you could go back to something like an overall axon of the project and just sort of point out what all the spaces are, because you sort of did the axon and then there's all these kind of, great renderings of scenarios, but if you could just sort of say within the overall context where those spaces are.
And maybe related to that is, I didn't quite catch, like, what is the, you must have said this, I just somehow missed this, like, what is the program of the building? Like, who, is this like a kind of urban zoo? Is it a research center? Yeah, I didn't catch what's happening inside the building beyond the species. Sure.
So the building is a kind of a, it's intended to be kind of a informed by a changing paradigm, and it's meant to help people understand the reality of the socio-ecological tensions in the urban environment. So it's meant to help people, teach people about their local ecosystems and the wildlife in the area, and learn ways in which they can themselves have an impact. So by participating in some actual building workshops where they actually build various habitat structures that they can like take home with them, and things like that. So it's part of a shift in the zeitgeist of the culture, and this place is meant to help that shift along, and it's kind of like the catalyst for it. So it helps people learn how to respond better to the surrounding wildlife and what they can do to help. So in terms of the program itself, I mean, I've put in different ideas. It's maybe not totally fixed in stone, but it's meant to do two things. First of all, this hybrid architectural environment is a place where they can actually come in and see animals that would be around of their own free will, of their own accord. So it's not bringing animals on purpose. So it's not acting like a zoo, but it's part of this idea of what if architecture was intertwined more with the surrounding ecology, and by providing access and providing opportunity, animals would be drawn in. And because of that, having that real life experience of seeing animals around, people might shed different misconceptions about animals and fears, and they can actually see what these animals are like if they're around. And then so that's one way. That's the actual experience. The other one is just educational programs like the workshops, the design workshop of different habitats, various classrooms. The theater turns into a kind of presentation space. There's also perhaps a laboratory, and there's kind of this program of kind of that teaches about environmental dynamics and kind of skill sets related to environmental related issues. Finally, there's actually also an animal hospital kind of integrated into there, but it's a secluded portion of the building campus. And it's kind of an extension, it was in my mind an extension of the Toronto Wildlife Center, which responds to all the calls of different animals being finding challenges in the city and being maimed by them. So this is kind of a second branch of that to kind of help that along. So I don't know if that answers the question. It's kind of a very long answer, but.
If that answers the question, I'll invite Joyce or Lola to start commenting, providing feedback or.
I guess maybe just to kind of maybe respond a bit to also what Lola's question might be implying is, I wonder if, because I definitely applaud your thesis and your kind of the exuberance of including animals within the kind of built environment and to provide all these kind of really kind of amazing experiences that you're showing in the project. So it's a great. Can you go back to the axon? I wanted to actually kind of talk to this a little bit. So I think when Lola is asking, what exactly is this? I think one of the things that might be helpful would be for you to maybe sort of invent a name, or to invent, in a way, it's sort of like a demonstration center kind of lab/education centers. There's like a whole bunch of program that you're bringing together to try to kind of, to try to bring together all these kind of experiences for living within a kind of synanthropic world. and bringing that experience to bear to, you know, to the kind of inhabitants and to the visitors and so on. And I think trying to find a way to kind of frame that as a program. So in the way that a zoo is a construction, is like your thing is a new thing that kind of needs like some kind of title that goes beyond just your, sorry, I gotta turn off my phone here, that goes beyond your thesis title. You know, is it a new kind of institution? Is it a new kind of learning center? And then I guess in that sense, like when I was looking at this, what I was trying to understand is when you're showing all of your spaces, I was actually trying to understand where are all the frictions, if there are any in this project between humans and animals, like, or all the spaces going to be, you know, heterogeneous and you get to experience everything everywhere, or are there going to be some spaces where the frictions are present, and how might you delineate those more?
Sure. Just to speak on the frictions, I mean, the blending occurs, can you see my mouse?
Yep.
The blending occurs mostly, almost exclusively here in terms of it being in an interior environment. So it's just in this large volume. There could be some interactivity on the outside, perhaps through the main axis, because animals can walk to different gardens and different parts of the landscape kind of surrounding the building. But the rest of the interior is supposed to be kind of closed off to just people, except for wherever animals are brought in under kind of a greater degree of control, perhaps in a presentation or in the hospital. There was something else I wanted to say. I forget. Okay, yeah.
I mean, I had a kind of very similar, in a way, question as Joyce. I mean, I'm also, you know, find the topic really interesting. The site is actually interesting. But it does feel like in all your discussion, there's, and this is, I find, happens a lot in theses, this sort of like, thou shalt cohabitate and it shall all be happy and peaceful. And I do, you know, I'm thinking of sometime last year, I walked into my office at Waterloo and there was some horrible stench, and no one's ever figured out what it was, but it smelled like an animal had died.
Right.
And I could actually, no, sorry. Well, one was a stench, and then one day I walked in and there was a dead mouse in my office, and I literally jumped out and shrieked, and I didn't re-enter my office for about a week. And so this is now I'm not as maybe attuned with nature as Joyce is, but I think this assumption that, I think this question of friction is crucial, right? We know that we even, you know, whenever I hear a raccoon in my front garbage, you know, my daughter goes out with a sort of broom and like shrieks. And so it isn't an easy cohabitation. And in some ways I found the earlier studies about, you know, calibrations to building envelope, to bricks, to something, sort of spoke to the idea that an interface could design the cohabitation and perhaps recognize that, you know, interior spaces really remain interior. And then, but how can a species occupy the roof or the underbelly or the walls or the dormers or the, and so in some ways your space of cohabitation, I'm more interested in like the landscapes and how the building might offer new views of these new wetlands and so forth. Because I find the space where you're talking about the actual cohabitation, it risks feeling like a zoo. And if we go back to your primary question, which was how can an urban landscape be more in sync? I don't know that this is a replicable role model, right? I mean, which maybe begs the question of, should you have looked at something that's more systemic that can be deployed, you know, on every new condo or every new mid-rise or all our malls or whatever. But I completely get the idea of the demonstration project. But I guess I wonder, like, in this heterogeneous space, what is replicable? You know, what could we have that in the atriums of our office towers? Could we, you know, could we have it in the atrium of the Waterloo School of Architecture or the Buffalo Entrance School of Architecture? You know, I guess, like, what works systemically and is reproducible, and what is kind of highly specific to this institution?
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question, and I've come across this question kind of, I think, previously as well. So there was a question about replicability, and then and there was something else I wanted to point out. So, oh yeah, the network. Okay, so if I can just quickly, well, I would like to just quickly pull to my thesis document where I talked about a phased approach to this re-envisioning and kind of redesigning the urban environment. So it's very, this space represents kind of the pinnacle of like the most intense way to combine people and animals. In the thesis document, I talked about a kind of phased approach where we kind of merge the boundaries between people and animals closer and closer, kind of in a very gradual way. So this would be kind of the extreme end of that. And so in this thesis project, I tried to test out what that extreme might be like. But in the thesis document, I'll just pull page 85. Excuse me. So I talked about how there's different levels of kind of interactivity between these opposing groups, and they can come in closer and closer until it's finally blended. And so this thesis assumes that the culture has kind of reached that point, and it's supposed to kind of be this center is supposed to act as a catalyst in a node of the system. So and pull up another image here. Excuse me. Here we go. So there are supposed to be different kind of nodes that provide habitat and different connections. And then one of these nodes can be a kind of a major node that connects animals, but also intersects with a human network or a cultural network. So this is kind of that focal point. So in terms of the reproducibility, so I think there are other kind of designs that can be kind of micro interventions that can be adhered onto exterior walls of buildings and things like that. This project kind of represents an idea, kind of that extreme idea of kind of letting animals in. So actually at Ryerson, we do have birds coming in to the atrium every now and then. This is kind of a more intense version of that kind of follows the Amazon spheres example, where here they have an abundance of vegetation throughout this large space. They don't have many animals. They have like some frogs and puddles and stuff, but this project is really trying to see what would it be like if things did get to the point where we are gradually more okay with animals and we kind of bring them in. Obviously, this is a very intense environment, and you know there might need to be like a maintenance crew and things like that. So there's a lot of tensions that need to be considered in trying to pursue something like this.
Right. I feel like you really could, I can definitely see this happening if there's maybe some focus on maybe precise locations where you might make a very precise shift. So I guess the reason I was like looking at the axon was also to try to figure out, what's the boundary between this heterogeneous space and the space adjacent to it, which I think is like classrooms or something. I think it was the educational thing that's next to it in the middle, right? Like what's the boundary between this type of space and a space where animals are not allowed, and what does that boundary look like? Or if there's maybe a sectional condition, like when you have all these kind of animals hanging, climbing all over a raccoon on the wall, what is happening below in case to receive the the droppings, or to receive, like, is there some sectional relationship between, you know, the ability for animals to kind of be in certain places and what's below? You know,
Right.
could that be a replicable, say, kind of sectional condition? Which is why I find your tower really interesting for that reason, the first tower that you showed, because it's something where the form of it is completely dependent on the kind of strategy for predators, you know, to keep predators away from the top. And it seems like it's a unified tower, but it has a sectional condition where you can understand the raccoon climbing into the bottom part and the owl in the top part, and that even though it looks like it's a continuous thing, it's actually not. And you know, and that or is it? No, yeah, it's not. So there's like a sectional relationship, and then the section of the top has to do with keeping predators away from the top, you know. So there's like a very kind of precise reason like why the section is the way it is. And I think that's something that I'm sort of looking for a little bit in the way that you're thinking about the bigger picture, and not the bigger picture, but the larger in the building, in your new program, your new center.
Oh yeah, that's a fair point. And over here, like I really kind of delved into the details and try to figure out exactly how the animals would interact with the different parts of this artifact, and this was a really interesting exercise to develop. I think the issue perhaps with the center is that I didn't bring it to a higher level of resolution with this kind of detail. But in terms of like sectionality, that space is kind of the only space where they can go into from different kind of entry points in the membrane. They're not supposed to be able to move anywhere else into the building. So if you look at this view, for example, this spiral stair, which kind of corkscrews down into the building, is kind of enclosed off. So supposedly people can circulate into here and then come out into this enclosed micro environment, I guess. And the classroom pods are also meant to be kind of closed off from animals, but the rest of the space is kind of interstitial and kind of allows animals to move around. But you make a fair point about kind of figuring out the details further. You know, part of the incentive to try to deal with those kind of things was giving the bottom floor of this space entirely over to animals. So that's kind of like the beginnings of a strategy that deals with those kind of issues. Perhaps the walkways can kind of have gaps in them and things. So there's definitely kind of more development that could be done to figure this out in greater detail.
I could mention something right now. Hi.
Do you mind if we finish
No
the
problem.
round?
Go ahead. Yeah, I just had.
But we'd love to have your comments. But let's, if you don't mind, we'll finish with the committee. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
No, Lola, if you want to go ahead.
I was just going to ask one other question on a very different front. I know this building well. I walk past it every day because my office is about 50 feet from it.
Okay.
And I'm curious. It's a great building. It's like one of these rare remnants of 1960s, or I was checking when it was built, but 60s or 70s modernism in Toronto, with a pretty unique sectional and site relationship. And I'm curious, I know this is not the crux of the project, but you chose this site and it is a provocative build. I mean, it's a provocative site and a provocative building. Can you speak a little bit to how you interface with the existing building? Because your project's pretty heavy, and sort of, yeah, I'm just curious how you view the existing building and how you interface with it.
What do you mean exactly by?
Well, for instance, in this photo, Joyce, I don't know if you know this building, but so it's a building that sort of bridges two parks. Bloor, which is, the main street in Toronto,
Yeah.
Bisects these two parks, and you actually see it in that plan on the sorry, right corner. So there's a big Christie Pitts Park and then this smaller Bickford Park, which has like a dog park and they play baseball and then whatever.
Yeah.
And so this building is a bit of a bridge, and that white bridge building is pretty powerful as a move because you actually slide under the white bridge. But then you go and build your own bigger bridge. And I guess I'm curious, like, for instance, the decisions to step down, like, as versus building a kind of second bridge building that might be a kind of parallel or mirror to the existing building, or even like you've chosen this sort of very heavy timber frame, whereas this is a kind of white concrete sort of high modernist expression. Like there's so many choices where you're clearly taking a radically different stand, but I don't know how much is deliberate and how much is just like, I'm just going to do my thing. So I'm curious if you could, from a kind of almost, I don't want to say preservationist, but
yeah, definitely. This site is really unique, and there's aspects to it that I wanted to maintain and kind of amplify in others. And so, for example, like this axis, this pathway that goes underneath, I kind of kept that, and then this block. I found that the kind of floor to ceiling height here, maybe perhaps because it's a relic from kind of older designs, like it is very low. And so I took the opportunity to just kind of redevelop this into something larger and grand and kind of amplify that, that white bridge, as you call it. And then also I did actually find that this chimney, I kind of thought it would be interesting to keep that as kind of a landmark in this unique site. So that's why, even though I do increase the height of this, I ensure to kind of step down so that, where's a good image?
so you're building behind it, right?
I'm building over top. I'm replacing it. I'm gutting that.
I see. The back, right, the back portion that faces Bickford. Right.
Yes. So just to clarify, like this space is replacing the white long bridge block, basically. And then the idea of the stepping came from many iterations of trying to give this a bit of a formal kind of characteristic of a kind of a landscape form, basically. And then it's also divided into like these three sections, and the central one acts as a kind of more open atrium inside that space, while these ones with a column grid that's more closer together supports these classroom pods on this side and one on this side as well. And then the chimney, I thought maybe these obelisks kind of help to echo it, and there's these geometrical tensions in the side of vertical members, horizontal members, and kind of organic undulating ones.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Terry, would you like to provide some feedback and comments?
Yes, thank you. When you were speaking and discussing through the project and this idea of animals existing and coming through the space, you had a note mentioning, when the operable windows are open,
right,
birds can come in. And it's like, what's the thought process there of restricting versus giving, animals the ability to enter or not? Like, in the idea of coexistence of species, wouldn't one assume that, this is completely porous on both the human and animal interaction?
Yeah. So that's a good point. I mean, I've definitely tackled that, and I had another iteration of this where this was more open, and this space wasn't actually enclosed with glazing and kind of allow year-round accessibility. The thing is, I mean, I admit that we are in Canadian climate and like I have to deal with the winter, so I am enclosing it and kind of closing off windows and things of that sort. However, I did kind of try to come up with a kind of a detail for kind of vestibules where it maintains the kind of the thermal boundary, but allows animals to pass through. And I do have a sketch in the appendix of what that looks like. So these kind of vestibules, I kind of thought of a system of like allowing animals to kind of enter through and kind of immediately kind of slide down so they don't get stuck in there and kind of loop back around. But it's definitely, it's really just a question of, how do you deal with winter? Another option was to actually, leave it open, just like Habitat 67 in Montreal, like those residences are enclosed, but their kind of circular corridors are open to the environment. They just have a kind of a wind block. So I definitely kind of played around with these two and just ended up settling on. It
seems like a, great hibernation location for a lot of these animals that otherwise choose chimneys or, bury under buildings. It's an option that, it almost over glorifies in the wintertime because it becomes this hub for, hibernation activity of animals that then, spill out into the city and live their lives in the summer.
Well, that's a fair point. And I think, this kind of development requires collaboration with people in different fields, like experts that kind of understand kind of the patterns, ecological patterns of animals and needs for hibernation, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Terry Peters, would you have any comment or feedback?
Thanks, Simon, for the presentation. It struck me while you were presenting and in this discussion, we've talked a lot about like sharing physical space with animals like you've shown here, but earlier on in your project, you were thinking about sharing space in terms of time, like that there would be, how much do we need to interact with animals, given that a lot of these animals might want to be out at night when maybe you're not having an educational event at the place that this is, this new educational demonstration project idea. So thinking about how we share space in or share time with animals in a space, maybe it's at night or different seasons. I think that's been picked up on, like we have different, in resyncing us with nature and nature with us, there's also this idea that they have their own their timing and their circadian patterns are different than ours. So how did you think about that in the final proposal? What would this be like at night?
Well, exactly. I mean, this is why I went to this slide, because I totally admit that, they do have different patterns, and a lot of these animals are nocturnal. So this space would actually see a lot of activity during the night, I imagine. I think definitely need to kind of consider how animals kind of migrate throughout the year, what their kind of reproduction time periods are, and kind of the more you go into this, the more you develop this, the more informed the design becomes in terms of maybe some places can be occupied by some animals at a certain time and then others at a later date. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Marco, would you like to make some comments?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Simon. And thanks everyone for the comments so far. It's a good discussion. I just wanted to come back to this question of friction, because I think that is something we've talked about throughout the project, and we've taken it further even than what was talked about here in terms of the unpleasant encounters with dead mice and so forth. It's things like disease are an issue. Like certainly it's been talked about recently. We don't know exactly what's gone on with this virus, but there's obviously a lot of discussion about it coming from, the wet markets and so forth. And there's always been a kind of tension between, protecting ourselves from diseases that are borne by animals and so forth. So definitely these areas of friction are really essential. So I think on the one hand, the project has kind of two different kind of identities in a sense. One which is quite pragmatic in the idea that there's this kind of paradigm shift, that there's an awareness that we live in this complex ecosystem, that we have to make room for other what did you call them, brain carriers at one point?
Yeah.
The idea that there are kind of practical issues associated with that. And I think the example of the obelisk is an interesting one because it addresses some very specific and particular issues related to specific species. The other identity of the project is very utopian, and it assumes a kind of I think, idealized relationship between all the various species. And I think that it's an interesting kind of tension in itself, that kind of the tension between the utopian and the pragmatic, which I think this project has a foot in both of those worlds. And I think that's interesting because in a way, I think many of us have long maintained that the utopian projects are the ones that, really kind of try to advance our thinking about architecture and how we can do things differently through architecture and so forth. So I think that the utopian side of the project is an important side of it. At the same time, it does tend to assume away some of these other issues that were certainly there through the process of the thesis, but are not necessarily embodied in the current version of it. So, for example, the biggest one being this issue of disease, and what happens when you have rabid raccoons and all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of complexity to this, right? I think it's been a really fascinating a thesis for me to have followed through, because I've learned an awful lot about things I knew very little about. I knew some of what you're talking about, but I haven't had very direct experience of it. And so it's been a really interesting kind of process of understanding better, not only, who we are sharing this environment with, but how they live in it and how they adapt. Some of these animals we've talked about need very little assistance. They seem to be doing very well on their own. Others obviously are much more challenged. And so there was, obviously also this interesting discussion about what species do you design for? Do you become species specific, or are you more inclusive? So obviously when you're dealing with something like barn owl, which, as you tell us, have been reduced to only 5 pairs in all of Ontario, and then you look at raccoons, skunks, and squirrels, well, those are different universes, right? So I think that's also, that becomes another interesting question, as how targeted does this become? Or does it become a kind of catch-all that doesn't discriminate in a sense, right? I think the choice of site is a really important one, excuse me, and I think that the complexities of dealing with the building aside, the integration of something like this into the creek system, the buried creek system and the ravine system of the city is a really interesting way to approach this, because it's kind of, in some sense, it's almost a ready-made, right? Like, we know that it's in the ravine systems that we have most of our wildlife, not necessarily these ravines that are very urban, but the ones more at the periphery of the city. But I think that what we're seeing through this lockdown is that with very little change, we start to see the emergence of this other life. And if we were able to relax our control over the environment, that we would see a lot more of this kind of activity in the city.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. I'll let someone else chime in.
So thank you very much, Simon, for your presentation. So I very much agree that the health concerns to a human or humans' concerns to animals could be continue to be articulated. I think it's really important, especially in our context. And I really appreciate that you have reflecting on COVID at the end. Maybe that's an area where it could be also discussed. Overall, the research, I think, is quite strong, the writing and your background research. But it would be really interesting to really clarify the existing and the additions. So is there a way to represent the additions that you have done so that these questions are clearly addressed?
Yeah.
And I think that the question of what is it exactly? Is it an observatory? Is it a place to heal? Is it a place for all of these endangered species or not? Which ones, and what is their food chains? And are we putting together some that probably would be challenging to have together? So I think that would be quite interesting. So we have a very little time for maybe one more comment from Lola, if you have, or from Joyce, if you wish. If not, we can wrap up.
No, I mean, I think it's a super interesting and continues to be a relevant question. I think for me, I think if you pursue this in any form, you know, through professional work, I think there's a kind of level of precision on so many levels of like tectonic precision, species human interface precision, which species, which plants. Even I was looking at your AXO and we see the sort of standard green, form, whatever, SketchUp green, and immediately there's a question of like, well, what's being planted up there? And then I think it goes to Margaret's question of, so I think that as designers, where we have a potential to contribute when we get specific and when we dig down. I feel like in a way there's like 8 theses within the thesis, and so it would be interesting to take one aspect of it and really push it, and maybe you submit it for an article or something. Like, I think the thesis has a lot of potential for continued breadth and investigation.
Thank you very much. Joyce, any last comment?
Yeah, well, I just want to say congratulations on a wonderful thesis project. Your research is really quite thorough and quite good. I was just scrolling through your PDF document earlier today, and there's a lot there that I think perhaps in the presentation it's hard to cover everything that you have done. I feel that your it's not so much about details so much as, at least for me, a kind of conceptual clarity in how you've developed that first prototype, the tower prototype, that I think has potential impacts in the way that we think about other relationships. So it's fascinating, for example, that you in that one prototype that you have a species that is kind of running rampant all over Toronto, the raccoon, and in the same structure you have the species that's almost extinct or that is endangered, and that you're housing them within the same structure, and there's a kind of seamlessness to the appearance, but that there's a division and a kind of safety measure for how they won't intersect, so that you don't have raccoons killing owls or whatever, right? So although that probably be more like owl killing the raccoon, but in any event, you don't have, so there's a very kind of precise, it's not just about the detailing, but it's about the kind of conceptual clarity of putting these two species together. And I think, and I don't think that I think that your larger proposal for the kind of new center is fascinating, but I do think that if you, in terms of what Lola's saying, like developing kind of, an idea for, maybe to kind of put something forward into like a publication or proposals for somewhere else, I think you could take moments within that, develop them to this level of clarity, and that could be a way to move forward. I think there's so many great ideas in this that, it's a very rich thesis, and I think there's a lot of possibilities for development of any of these these situations.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So thank you very, very much, Simon. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you to our external guest reviewers, Joyce Huang from sunny Buffalo and Lola Shepherd from the University of Waterloo. Thank you also to the committee, so Marco Polo, the supervisor, second reader, Terry Peters. So this concludes the presentation. Thank you for the guests who have joined us online, and for Tone for joining us here. So this concludes the presentation, and we will deliberate. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you. This was really good feedback, and thank you really for coming on. It's really great to have you in the discussion. So I really appreciate it. So thank you.
And so Simon, I will contact you once we've finished our deliberation.
Sure.
So wait for my my email invitation that'll be a separate Zoom meeting.
Yep.
So if you can leave us now, and Tony, if you can leave us now, we will go in
Do
camera.
we
as
leave
they say.
also, right?
No, you remain.
we
Guests,
stay.
please, sorry,
Okay.
please remain.